Chris Jericho didn't hold back when he sat down to write his life story, and some of the things he revealed about fellow wrestlers would absolutely shock you. This is the untold story of one of wrestling's greatest talkers and what he really thought about the biggest names in the industry. If you love wrestling drama and backstage chaos, you need to stick around until the end because we're about to reveal exactly what Jericho said that got people talking. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these wild wrestling stories. The wrestling world had no idea what was coming when Chris Jericho decided to tell his version of events in his autobiography. For years, fans watched him on television cutting promos and getting into feuds, but his books revealed a completely different side of the man behind the character. Jericho had worked with everyone from Stone Cold Steve Austin to The Rock, and he wasn't going to sugarcoat his experiences with any of them. When his books started circulating through the wrestling community, people realized that the Y2J persona was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to Jericho's opinions and observations about the wrestling business. One of the most controversial revelations came when Jericho discussed his early encounters with some of the biggest names in wrestling history. He went into detail about how certain wrestlers treated him when he first arrived in major promotions, and he didn't pull any punches describing their behavior. Jericho explained that some of the guys he admired most turned out to be completely different people behind the scenes compared to how they appeared in front of cameras. He talked about the disconnect between the public image and the private reality of professional wrestling, and it painted a picture of an industry that was far more complicated than fans ever realized. Jericho's accounts of his time in different wrestling territories showed a man who was constantly observing and learning from everything around him. He described specific incidents where wrestlers would test him or try to make his life difficult, which was supposedly common for newcomers trying to prove themselves. His writing revealed that professional wrestling wasn't just about performing moves and telling stories in the ring, but it was also about surviving a culture that could be incredibly harsh and unforgiving. Jericho explained how these experiences shaped him and made him tougher, both mentally and physically, preparing him for the challenges that would define his legendary career. When it came to discussing his relationships with top-tier talent, Jericho was remarkably candid about his feelings and experiences. He shared stories about working with wrestlers who were considered legends in the industry, and some of these accounts challenged the narratives that fans had built up over the years. Jericho didn't shy away from discussing moments where he felt disrespected or undervalued, and he also talked about times when he realized certain wrestlers were dealing with their own struggles and personal demons. His perspective offered a humanizing look at the wrestling business, showing that even the biggest stars were dealing with insecurities and pressures that often went unnoticed by the general public. The book covered Jericho's thoughts on competition and rivalry, and he was extremely honest about how he viewed his opponents both inside and outside the ring. He discussed the mental aspect of professional wrestling and how important it was to stay in character and maintain the mystique of being a larger-than-life personality. Jericho wrote about creating feuds that would grab the attention of audiences and explained his philosophy on what made wrestling entertainment rather than just athletic competition. He revealed that much of his success came from understanding psychology and knowing exactly what buttons to push to get crowds invested in his matches and storylines. Throughout his autobiography, Jericho made it clear that his mouth and his ability to talk had been one of his greatest assets throughout his career. He discussed specific moments when his commentary or his promos had angered wrestlers backstage, and he explained that he understood the risks he was taking by being so outspoken. Jericho wrote about times when his words caused legitimate heat with other performers, and sometimes this heat translated into better matches and more compelling storylines. He understood that in professional wrestling, controversy and conflict were sometimes necessary ingredients for creating compelling entertainment that would keep audiences tuning in week after week. Jericho's reflections on his matches and feuds showed a man who was constantly thinking about his craft and how to improve his performances. He talked about studying other wrestlers and learning from their techniques and their ability to captivate crowds. In his books, Jericho expressed appreciation for many of his opponents while also being critical of wrestlers who he felt weren't putting in the effort or who seemed to coast based on their name recognition alone. He discussed the difference between wrestlers who understood the psychology of the business and those who were simply going through the motions without considering the storytelling aspect of their performances. The wrestling community took notice when Jericho's accounts started circulating among fans and within the industry itself. Some wrestlers responded to his comments, either defending themselves or offering their own perspectives on the situations he described. This created additional layers of drama because suddenly the wrestling world was buzzing about what Jericho had written and what other wrestlers thought about his characterizations. Fans found themselves debating whether Jericho's accounts were fair assessments or if he was exaggerating certain situations to make his stories more compelling. The discussions generated by his book created a whole new conversation around the wrestling business and how wrestlers really treated each other behind the scenes. Jericho also devoted sections of his autobiography to discussing the evolution of professional wrestling over the decades. He talked about how the business had changed from when he was starting out to when he was at the peak of his career. He discussed the impact of technology and social media on wrestling, and how these changes had altered the relationship between performers and fans. Jericho reflected on how wrestlers in the modern era had different pressures and different opportunities compared to wrestlers from previous generations. His perspective as someone who had been in the business for so long gave him a unique vantage point from which to observe these shifts in the industry. The books revealed Jericho's thoughts on training, preparation, and the physical toll that professional wrestling takes on performers. He discussed injuries he had suffered throughout his career and how he had learned to work around these injuries to continue performing at a high level. Jericho wrote about the mental challenges of dealing with pain and trying to maintain the illusion of being superhuman while your body was screaming for rest and recovery. He talked about seeing other wrestlers struggle with these same issues and sometimes handling it worse than he did. His honesty about the physical and mental demands of professional wrestling painted a picture of an industry that asks performers to sacrifice their bodies and their personal lives for the sake of entertainment. Jericho used his autobiography to discuss his philosophy on longevity and staying relevant in an industry that constantly pushes for younger performers to take the spotlight. He talked about reinventing himself multiple times throughout his career and understanding that stagnation would lead to being forgotten. Jericho wrote about his decision to leave wrestling at certain points and pursue other interests, only to return because he realized that professional wrestling was his true passion. He reflected on how these breaks from wrestling helped him gain perspective and come back with fresh ideas about how to entertain audiences. The impact of Jericho's autobiography extended beyond just providing interesting stories about his life in wrestling. His words sparked conversations about the wrestling business itself and how it operated on different levels than what fans saw on television. Young wrestlers starting out in the industry read his books and gained insights into what they might expect as they climbed the ranks. Fans gained a deeper appreciation for Jericho's career and understood the thought and strategy that went into everything he did. The wrestling community as a whole was forced to reckon with some of the truths that Jericho had exposed through his writing. Chris Jericho proved through his autobiography that he was just as skilled with a pen as he was with a microphone. His willingness to speak his mind and tell his story in his own words established him as not just a wrestler but also a legitimate author who had something meaningful to say about the entertainment industry. The book became essential reading for anyone who wanted to understand professional wrestling beyond the surface level. If you found this story fascinating and want to hear more incredible tales from the wrestling world, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss out on these amazing stories.